So it's session 39 tonight, for the benefit of the tape, and apologies that we've had to cancel the last couple of sessions, but I'm sure you understand and appreciate the reasons. But just to sort of recap very quickly, we're beginning to look at the 9th chapter of the Apocalypse under the 5th angel. And if you remember, the 5th angel was the first of the woe trumpets. We'd got the 4 wind trumpets in chapter 8, which had to do with the downfall of the Western Roman Empire. The 5th and 6th trumpet in chapter 9 are the 2nd and 3rd woe trumpets, which are to do with the downfall of the Eastern Roman Empire, corresponding obviously to the 2 legs of the image of Daniel chapter 2, which was to bring about the collapse of that great empire of Rome. Now you remember that we suggested to you that there was a good reason why we've got far more details in chapter 9 on the 2 woe trumpets than we have on the wind trumpets of chapter 8. Mainly because it was going to span a much more considerable amount of time, whereas those under the wind trumpets were to happen fairly quickly because the western part of Rome fell in AD 476. The 9th chapter was going to scale a period of time which was going to take us to the 15th century. But the second and perhaps the more important reason is that the 2 woe trumpets of chapter 9 were to affect this earth perhaps even more so than the events of the 8th chapter. Because not only were they to bring to an end the Eastern Roman Empire and therefore the total Roman Empire in effect, but they were introducing upon the world scene nations and powers which were going to have a considerable impact themselves upon world affairs. Because in chapter 9, under the 1st woe trumpet, we are going to see the uprise of the Mohammedan power, and of course the Muslim faith has very much increased from the time of the 5th trumpet, the 1st woe trumpet, reaching down to our day and generation. And indeed, even today, the faith of the Muslims is seen very extensively throughout the earth. And it was all to begin under the symbols of this 1st woe trumpet. The 2nd woe trumpet is to do with the Turkish power, and of course it was the Ottoman Empire which again had a considerable impact upon world history during the ages down almost to this day and generation. And so chapter 9 is a very significant chapter from both points of view. A, to see the total collapse of the Roman Empire, and also to introduce us to these 2 great powers of the Muslims and the Ottoman Empire. Now, if we come to the details of chapter 9, you'll remember we had commenced with the consideration of a star falling from heaven unto the earth, and to him was given the key of the bottomless pit. And we laid great stress on the actual translation of what we've got in verses 1 and 2 on the bottomless pit. And if you remember, I quoted to you from the Jerusalem Bible, where in verse 1 it quotes this way: "The 5th angel blew his trumpet, and I saw a star that had fallen from heaven unto the earth, and he was given the key to the shaft leading down to the abyss." And again, in verse 2, "when he had unlocked the shaft of the abyss." Now, we laid great stress upon that for a very important reason. We quoted elsewhere in the Apocalypse that where we've got the phrase, the bottomless pit, it literally just simply means the abyss, the deep, the waters. It never relates to the shaft to the abyss, but it does here in chapter 9. So although in the authorized version the phrase the bottomless pit appears elsewhere in the Apocalypse, if you'll notice from your margin, by verse 1, you've got it occurring in verse 2, verse 11, chapter 11, verse 7, chapter 17, verse 8, chapters 20, verses 1 and 3, and we looked at each and every one of those quotations, and although we've got in the authorized version the phrase the bottomless pit, in the Greek it simply means the abyss. Where here in chapter 9, verses 1 and 2, it's the shaft to the abyss, not the abyss itself. Now we use the allusion or the simile of the well. The well, the bottom of it where the water is the actual abyss, the actual pit, the deep. But the shaft which leads down to it is obviously the shaft of the well. And that's the idea which the Revelator is trying to convey to us in chapter 9, verses 1 and 2. It's not having direct reference to the abyss, but the shaft, the means of access to the abyss. Now, why should that be necessary to stress? Well, if we can go to Revelation chapter 17, and we'll just, while we go into the 17th chapter, have a look at one of those phrases which appears in verse 8, for example. The beast that thou sawest was and is not, and shall ascend out of the bottomless pit. And that simply is the word or the phrase, the abyss. It's not the shaft to the abyss, but the abyss itself, although we've got the phrase bottomless pit. Now if you look in verse 15, John gives us an explanation of what the bottomless pit, what the abyss was, where the beasts were to come in chapter 13, etc. He says, the waters which thou sawest, where the horse sitteth, are peoples and multitudes and nations and tongues. And throughout the Apocalypse, the abyss, rendered elsewhere as the deep, has reference to the waters. And the waters are representing peoples and nations and tongues. And as far as the Revelation is concerned, the peoples that it's referring to, of course, are the peoples which were part of the earth as far as the Revelation was concerned. Of course, that in the main was to refer to the Roman Empire. And so when later on in our studies we come to the 13th chapter where John sees the beast coming out of the sea, he obviously sees the uprise of that power represented by the beast coming out of the Roman Empire, out of the sea of humanity, which was represented by peoples, nations and tongues of that time, which of course relates to the Roman peoples. Now again, when we'll come to the 17th chapter, God willing, if the Master hasn't come by then, we shall also see that the bottomless pit has reference to the sea of humanity, again based upon the Roman Empire. So coming back to chapter 9, although we are to understand the bottomless pit in exactly the same way, i.e. referring to the Roman Empire, and of course specifically now to the eastern part of the Roman Empire, because the west had basically gone because it had been taken over by the barbarian tribes. Chapter 9 is not relating directly to the peoples and nations of the Roman Empire, but is referring to the shaft which leads to that empire. In other words, it's the means of access to it rather than the empire itself or the peoples themselves. Now that's very significant when we begin to appreciate what the symbols are referring to in chapter 9. Now we suggested to you that the star which fell from heaven unto the earth was the man Mohammed. And we're going to have a look at the history of him in just a few moments. But he began the uprise which eventually was going to have quite an effect upon the eastern part of the Roman Empire. But the first thing that Mohammed and his successors conquered was not the eastern part of the Roman Empire directly, but had reference to the area of Arabia. And it was where the Arab people were congregated that Mohammed was to first have its effect. Now that in turn was to lead towards the eastern part of the Roman Empire, which of course had its headquarters in Constantinople. But there is a distinction, and the Revelator wants us to understand the distinction, that whereas in the 8th chapter, for example, the barbarian tribes had an effect towards Rome, and their battles was towards the army of the western part of the Roman Empire. But as far as chapter 9 was concerned, with the uprising of Mohammed, although, of course, it was to have some effect, it was not an out-and-out attack upon the eastern part of the Roman Empire. He simply started by taking over the area of the land which we know today as Arabia and the countries which surround it. That then obviously sent out the panic signals to Constantinople and the eastern part of the Roman Empire. But it was not a direct attack. And therefore, to him, this man Mohammed was given the key to the shaft which leads to the abyss. In other words, he was given the power, the opportunity by God to effect the area which will eventually lead onto the bottomless pit, the abyss, the Roman Empire. But it was not direct to it. And therefore it was the shaft. It was a means of access to it without being directly involved with it. I hope that's quite clear, because it is an important point to appreciate that we are beginning to see the crumbling of the Eastern Roman Empire, but Mohammed himself did not directly go against Constantinople. We shall see that as the symbols unfold. His work was to bind together the Arabian people under the banner of Muslim, so that in turn they might begin to have an effect upon the Eastern Roman Empire. But it wasn't a direct attack, and therefore he was simply given the power towards the abyss by the means of the shaft, the access to it. And that's why we laid great stress last time on this idea of the shaft which leads to the abyss and not the abyss itself. And so it was going to refer to the gaining of control by Mohammed of the area of Arabia. Now let me just give you some brief history of the man himself. And again, apologies in advance that of course a lot of chapter 9 is going to be historical, but history perhaps with a difference, because the Muslim faith is very much alive today, and the Muslim faith and the Muslim calendar has affected many, many centuries of time. So because they are such a powerful organisation today, and so many prominent figures are part of the Muslim faith, I think it's perhaps good to recapture some of the reasons that it gained a foothold and became such a strong power as it is today, particularly because of the wars we are seeing or hearing about in the Middle East with Iraq and Iran and all that sort of thing. They're all affecting the Middle East area, and of course have a great bearing upon Muslimism and the things which relate back to Muhammad. So Muhammad himself was born in AD 570, and he lived in the city of Mecca. And as he grew up, he became part of the clan whose job it was to guard the sacred black stone at Mecca. Now this stone, as we briefly discussed last time, was almost like a shrine, like the goddess Diana of the Ephesians was to Ephesus. It was something that the people of Mecca held in great high esteem, became almost a god to them, and thought that's where their power and influence came from. It's like if we go back into the Old Testament scriptures, you've got the Baal worship, Ashtaroth and all these others. So this black stone at Mecca was sacred as far as these people was concerned, and therefore constant guard was put upon it to make sure that nobody obviously destroyed it or took it away. Now, whilst this man, Mohammed, was still young, he claimed that he was a prophet because he had had direct communication with God. Now again, we shouldn't think that too unusual, because the Jehovah's Witness faith has been based upon a certain man who claimed that he had received a revelation from God. Again, our friends in the Church of Jesus Christ of the Latter-day Saints, which of course are quite a powerful organisation, known more commonly as the Mormons, of course, again claim that plates were found which gave them an extra insight into the understanding of Scripture, which us poor mortals have not received. And therefore there are many, many large groups of people today who bring allegiance to either one of these two denominations, both of which started by claiming that they had received direct communication from God. And so it was with this man, Mohammed. And he began to preach what he believed was the true religion. And of course he brought him in great conflict with the people of Mecca, because he was in effect saying that this black stone which they worshipped was useless. It was not a god, and therefore they all ought to worship the one true God. Now it's very important to get in your minds that Mohammed was preaching a monotheistic God, a one God principle. He did not believe, like for example the Catholics in the Roman Empire believed, in a Trinity. He preached and taught one God. The fact that he called him Allah rather than the true God was obviously at this moment in time not that important, because of course in his part of the world there was not many of the true beliefs. The brethren and sisters of the Lord Jesus Christ were basically in a minority still in the Roman Empire. But the contrast was initially that he was preaching something which was against the worship of this black stone. Now again, trying to get the impression which this caused, we've only got to take our minds back to the Acts of the Apostles when Paul was preaching in Ephesus. And you remember the uproar which was caused because the people of Ephesus had great gain from their worship of Diana of the Ephesians. They made the shrines. It was a great publicity stunt. And there were hordes of tourists who went to Ephesus simply to see and worship this great Diana. And therefore, they lined their pockets very nicely by this worship. And therefore, when Paul stood up in their midst and says, look, it's a load of nonsense. It's nothing but an idol. You've all got to turn to worship the one true God and Jesus Christ who he sent. And of course, it caused an uproar. So much so that it had to, the town clerk had to come on the scene, if you remember, to appease the mob. And of course he had to appeal to them that, the Ephesians didn't do things by mob rule, and there was a set procedure which had to be adopted if they had got a complaint. But it caused such a furor amongst the Ephesians because Paul dared to say that Diana was not true. And so it was with this man Mohammed. And therefore he was soon expelled in disgrace from being one of the guards of this stone, and eventually he was driven out from Mecca. Now he made his way from Mecca, not too far away, to a place called Medina. Now the Muslim faith really honours those two cities. They've become, to them what the Vatican City is to the Roman Catholics. And the events which took place as Mohammed went from Mecca to Medina was known to them, or is known to them, as the Hijra. And it simply means the flight. Not that he actually flew, but he obviously went very quickly for his life from Mecca to Medina. And they call that the Hijra. And that happened in the year AD 622. And of course, it's that year which is particularly honoured by the Muslims. We'll come to that later on. Round about this time, nobody knows exactly what time, Mohammed wrote the Quran. And of course, as you all know, the Quran is to the Muslims what the Bible is to us who believe, and generally to all Christians. But as I said, the one great feature of the Quran is that it professed one God, the same as the Bible does, but not as the Bible was being interpreted by the Catholics of the day. And therefore, by the very existence of the Quran and the belief in the one God, which was held up very highly by Muhammad, it was declaring war, in effect, upon the Trinitarianisms of the Catholics and the people of that day. Now, as his power grew amongst the Arabs, and many of the Arabs flocked to him because they saw in him a new leader, almost a Messiah, who could deliver them from the power of the Eastern Roman Empire, he sent ambassadors to Constantinople for them now to recognize him and to stop the oppression. They treated him with utter contempt. They didn't want to know. They felt it was of no significance to the great power which was Rome that a few Arabs should combine together with religious fervour and think that they could begin to dictate to the power of Constantinople. So they just sent them away. So what he did, in effect, was declare war. Not openly. Not to the point that he was going to muster his forces and march on Constantinople. But he began to organise and lay claim to the area of Arabia. And so he began, bit by bit, as the years went on, to lay siege, as it were, to the Arabian part of the Roman Empire. But he died in the year AD 632 before he could accomplish what he had set out to do. And he was succeeded by a man who was named Abu Bakr, Abubeker, who was the first caliph of the Arabs. Now again, you will remember, at least, even if it's only through films, that the caliphs are of course well known in history, and we probably remember the thief of Baghdad and the caliph which ruled. And the first caliph was this man, Abu Bakr, who succeeded Muhammad and began, or shall we say, continued what Muhammad had started. Now coming back to chapter 9 of the Apocalypse. So this was the man, the star, who fell from heaven, from the point of being held in high esteem as the royal guard of this precious stone. He fell from the political situation to the earth, and to him, this man Muhammad, was given the power. We've seen the word key represents power before, the means of being able to open something. We saw it in chapter 1 of the Apocalypse when the Lord Jesus Christ had the key to death and the grave. To him was given this key to the shaft which leads to the bottomless pit. And the shaft was going to be the area of Arabia. And he opened the shaft of the bottomless pit, of the abyss. Not the bottomless pit itself. Again, in the Jerusalem Bible as we quoted, it's the shaft. And there arose out of it smoke, out of the pit, as the smoke of the great furnace. And the sun and the air were darkened by reason of the smoke of the pit. Now if we go back in the Old Testament scriptures, we would find that fire and smoke, and as the old saying goes, there is no smoke without fire, so obviously it's representing both, is referred to back in the Old Testament scriptures. Come back to Deuteronomy chapter 29. And you will see again what's being symbolised in chapter 9 of the Apocalypse. Deuteronomy 29, verse 19 for connection. And it come to pass, when he heareth the words of this curse, that he bless himself in his heart, saying, I shall have peace, I will walk in the imagination of mine heart to add drunkenness to thirst. Yahweh will not spare him. But then the anger of Yahweh and his jealousy shall smoke against that man, and all the curses that are written in this book shall lie upon him, and Yahweh shall blot out his name from under heaven. Now obviously, when his jealousy shall smoke against him, he's not speaking in the literal sense. God's not going to send smoke against the man who obviously ignores the curses which were written. But of course, it's speaking of the anger, the wrath of God. Yahweh will not spare him, but then the anger of Yahweh and his jealousy shall smoke against him. In other words, it will blow against him, and it will obviously cause him to feel the impact of the divine indignation against him. Now, this is further enlarged in Psalm 74. And again, you'll see the idea of the anger being associated with the smoke. Psalm 74 and verse 1. O God, why hast thou cast us off forever? Why does thine anger smoke against the sheep of thy pasture? Again, the idea of the anger smoking against the sheep of the pasture. And again in Isaiah 31, where we've got the next stage of the phrase of chapter 9 of the Apocalypse. Verse 8 of Isaiah 31, Then shall the Assyrian fall with the sword, not of a mighty man, and the sword not of a mean man shall devour him, but he shall flee from the sword, and his young men shall discomfort him. And he shall pass over to his stronghold for fear, and his princes shall be afraid of the ensign, saith Yahweh, whose fire is in Zion, and his furnace is in Jerusalem. So again, in the latter days, when the great Assyrian host, being represented here, the great power of the north, Gog of Ezekiel 38, Yahweh's fire in indignation and wrath will, of course, be turned against him. Not necessarily because the fire literally is going to devour, but speaking in the symbolic sense that the fire speaks of the wrath and the war which obviously will ensue in that day. And that's the idea we've got coming back to chapter 9 of the Apocalypse and verse 2. There arose smoke as the smoke of a great furnace. If you look at a furnace normally, you don't see just smoke, you see bellowing fire. And of course, that was the impression that was being given. The smoke representing the wrath, the indignation, which was being shown by Mohammed and the Arabians, Saracens as they were then known, against the Eastern Roman Empire. But it was all situated in the area of Arabia. And it was as the smoke of the great furnace. Now it's interesting that we've got the idea of the smoke from another point of view. Now I can only put this to you as a suggestion for you to consider. If you can just think of the map of where the power of Rome was established in Constantinople and around that area, and all this was happening beyond Israel down in the area of Arabia. And they were beginning to make their inroads because obviously they were beginning to throw over the traces of the power of Rome, which of course established themselves down in that area, not to a considerable degree, but the whole earth, as far as that part of the world was concerned, was under the jurisdiction of Rome. And so as the Arabians, as the Saracens under this man Mohammed began to make their effect felt, it was rising up, as it were, as smoke to be seen by Constantinople, almost rising on the horizon. And I'm not again talking in a literal sense, but again I'm sure you can picture the scene, that if you were sort of in the headquarters and there was battles being fought out in the distance, the first sign almost of the battle, not because it was directly affecting you, would be the smoke as it came up on the horizon. And that's the effect which the Revelator is trying to get us to understand. The smoke was ascending out of the shaft of the pit because the area of Arabia was now being taken over by Mohammed and the Saracens, and it was being seen, obviously, and it was being seen in the sense that the emissaries would go back to Constantinople to report what was happening, and therefore the effect of it is the end of verse 2. The sun and the air were darkened by reason of the smoke of the pit. The sun and the air were darkened. Now again, just think what we've seen before. We're not talking of literal things, we're talking about symbolic. And when we've seen the sun before, we have seen the ruling power of the political heavens of that day. And the air, obviously, is the atmosphere of the political heavens. And what was happening in the Middle East with Mohammed was having the effect of beginning to darken, by reason of the smoke, the political heavens of the Eastern Roman Empire. Not because they were being overthrown, not because they were being directly challenged, but the atmosphere of the Roman Empire was being darkened because of the effect that Mohammed was having in the Middle East area. And therefore it's a very gradual occurrence. A smoke, first of all you got the puffs of it and then it begins to billow up. And it takes quite a considerable time before you could literally say, and you start coughing and spluttering, that the atmosphere is filled with smoke. And so that was what was happening with Mohammed. It began to have an effect to the point that the air, the atmosphere of the political scene in Rome was beginning to be affected by what was happening. And that's the point there. And if you want to put some dates to it, in AD 634, Damascus was taken by the Saracens under this man, Abu Bakr. So Damascus was taken. 634. In AD 637, just 3 years later, Jerusalem was taken. So from Mecca, Medina, from the area of Saudi Arabia, as we know today, check your map, you will find the holy cities, as they are termed today, of Mecca and Medina, are right there in Saudi Arabia. They began to go out more and more to the point they went to the north and Damascus was taken, they went to the west and Jerusalem was taken, so that the whole of the Middle East was now under the jurisdiction of the Saracens, under the caliphs, the Arabs, the Muslims, and the air, the scene, as far as the political power of Rome was concerned, was being darkened. And then in verse 3, we find there came out of the smoke, out of what was being created, locusts upon the earth. Locusts upon the earth. Now, I'm sure many times you must have done at some time, in Bible class studies, you would have considered the locusts. They are referred to many times in the scriptures of truth. Now, in the Hebrew, the word for locusts is arbeh, A-R-B-E-H. A-R-B-E-H, or sometimes spelt A-R-B-I. And of course it's a word very closely connected to the word Arab itself. And therefore the locusts are an apt description of the Arabs in this context. But that's not the only reason, even if it's a reason at all. That's just, something to consider. The locusts, as we've said, are used throughout the scriptures to denote great armies. For example, probably the most famous one is in Joel chapter 1. Now again, we're going back to the Old Testament scriptures just to underline the fact, not because what we read in the Old Testament scriptures is telling us that's the power which is being referred to in Apocalypse chapter 9. What we are showing is the way that the symbology of the locust has been used before to represent powers, and therefore we bring it up to date in the 9th chapter of the Apocalypse. Now of course Joel chapter 1 says in verse 4, that which the palmer worm hath left, hath the locust eaten. And that which the locust hath left, the cankerworm hath eaten. And that which the cankerworm hath left, hath the caterpillar eaten. And of course Joel was speaking of the impending judgment by Babylon upon Jerusalem. And therefore he uses, under the symbol of the locust, the hordes of Babylon. Now again, if we go back to Jeremiah chapter 6, again, the same idea is used. Jeremiah chapter 6, and in verse 22 for connection. Behold, a people cometh from the north country, and a great nation shall be raised from the sides of the earth. They shall lay hold on bow and spear. They are cruel and have no mercy. Their voice roareth like the sea, and they ride upon horses, set in array as men for war against thee, O daughter of Zion. Now Jeremiah is obviously referring to here the power of Babylon as it was going to come against Jerusalem. Exactly the same power what Joel was using in chapter 1 of his prophecy under the symbology of the locusts. Now what Jeremiah has to say is very descriptive of the locusts. Verse 23. They shall lay hold on bow and spear. They are cruel. They have no mercy. Their voice roareth like the sea, and they ride upon horses. And of course, the locust is seen as a symbol of desolation and destruction. As you will know, the locust will literally strip anything in its way. And the amazing thing about the locusts is that they do it not just for hunger. Now, most animals or insects or whatever will only destroy or fight when they want food. But the locust is almost unique. They will do it for anger and not just for food. Now, I've brought along Thompson's book, The Land and the Book. Now, you've probably all got copies or can obtain copies. Obviously, what this chap Thompson does is not only give us a very, very good description of the Holy Land, but also gives us a lot of the customs which happened in biblical times, and also describes in detail the animals and the insects and all the other things which we read of in the scriptures as they appeared to him as he travelled throughout the Middle East. And there's a lot to say concerning the locusts. And of course they're awful looking creatures. And I just want to read just a few extracts, if I may. But if you've got the book, may I suggest that you make a note of the page and read it at your leisure to get the full impact of the scourge of these locusts. It's in Thompson's Land and the Book from page 416, and it goes right through to page 420. 416 to 420. But he says, I had my first introduction some 20 years ago to the far-famed locusts of the east. Noticing something peculiar on the hillside, I rode up to examine it, when to my amazement the whole surface became agitated and began to roll down the decline. My horse was so terrified that I was obliged to dismount. Their numbers seemed infinite, and in their haste to get out of my way, they literally rolled over and over like semi-fluid mortar, an inch or two in thickness. Many years after this, I became better acquainted with these extraordinary creatures. And then he begins to tell us something about the way that they develop from the eggs and the way they grow and all this sort of thing. But then he says, their number was astounding. The whole face of the mountain was black with them. On they came like a living deluge. We dug trenches. We kindled fires. We tried to beat them. We tried to burn them to death. Burn them to death. But the effort was utterly useless. Wave after wave rolled up the mountainside and poured over rocks, walls, ditches and hedges. After a long and fatiguing contest, I descended the mountain to examine the depth of the column, but I could not see to the end of it. Everything in their path was destroyed and devastated. And then he goes on to give a great detail of how many they literally tried to destroy and the way they just came on. And then he goes on, I do not remember, in their march, they devour every green thing, and with wonderful expedition. A large vineyard and a garden adjoining mine was green as a meadow in the morning, but long before night it was naked and bare as a newly ploughed field or dusty road. The noise made in marching and foraging was like that of a heavy shower on distant forest. And then he goes on to say, the references to the habits and behaviour of locusts in the Bible are very striking and accurate. Joel says, He hath laid my vine waste and barked my fig tree. He hath made it clean bare and cast it away. The branches thereof are made white. These locusts at once strip the vines of every leaf and cluster of grapes and of every green twig. In view of the utter destruction which they effect, the prophet exclaims, Alas, for the day of the Lord is at hand. As a destruction from the Almighty shall it come. Is not the meat cut off before our eyes? This is most emphatically true. I saw under mine own eye not only a large vineyard loaded with young grapes, but whole fields of corn disappear as if by magic, and the hope of the husbandman vanish like smoke. And he goes on and on and on to describe the terrible power of the locust, which Charles has just presented me with, which it's dead, I hasten to add, will pass round so that you can see the effect of millions and millions of these awful creatures. Now, we won't go through all the rest of the references in the scriptures. I'm sure you've got the picture and I'm sure you understand what's being described. But can we take the thought back now to chapter 9 of the Apocalypse? Chapter 9 of the Apocalypse and verse 3. Now, I don't know what you're worried about. John the Baptist ate locusts and wild honey. Right, chapter 9 of the Apocalypse, verse 3. Thanks, Charles. They came out of the smoke, out of this area which had been sort of beginning to be darkened by the uprise of the Saracens, locusts upon the earth. And that was a very fitting description of the uprise of the Arabs. They were like locusts, not only for their numbers, and of course they were a great multitude which came up under the banner of the Muslim faith, but also the effect they were to have, because as you probably gather, the Arabs are not very good at cultivating the ground. On the contrary, Colin, I'm sure, wouldn't employ one of them, because they tend to be devastating rather than productive. And therefore, as they conquered the various areas of the earth, obviously it almost had the effect of scorpions literally covering the ground. But you'll notice, unto them was given power. Unto them was given power. As the scorpions of the earth have power. Now, why should that be? Well, of course, again, it is generally understood and acknowledged that the Arabians do not make very good fighters. And therefore, as a war machine against the power of the Roman Empire, they would almost be of little or no effect. And that's what I'm sure the people who were in charge of Constantinople thought at that time. The Arabs are not a fighting race, and therefore what effect could they have upon the might of Rome? But what they forgot to appreciate, and of course they were ignorant of these things, power was given unto them. And of course the power was not of themselves. It was given of God to bring about his purpose in the earth. And the power was given to them as the scorpions of the earth have power. Now, there is a superb reference in the book of Proverbs. Can we go to Proverbs chapter 30? Now, the wise man, obviously, knowing most about everything, knew something also about the locusts. And in Proverbs chapter 30, and in verse 27, he says, the locusts have no king, yet they go forth all of them by bands. Now, I hasten to mention anything about bees because I've got such an expert on my right-hand side here. But I think it is common knowledge that the bees have a queen, and everything revolves around the queen bee. But that's not the fact with locusts. They don't seem to have any leader at all. And yet they all go in the one direction and they all go working for each other. But nothing seems to sort of bind them together as with the bee colonies. And so the wise men correctly say, the locusts have no king. But who placed into them the instinct, or whatever you like to call it, for them all to go forth by bands? And of course he was speaking of the power of the Almighty. And of course that's exactly what we've got in the Apocalypse chapter 9. Because you will notice in verse 11, when we come to examine that, speaking of this locust power, they had a king over them. Well, of course the locusts have no king. But power was given to them, and they all came under, first of all, Mohammed, and then the caliphs, started by Abu Bakr, which succeeded him, and then succeeding down, generation after generation, through the caliphs. And the power was of God. He united the Arab race into a fighting machine. And therefore, although not normally united, and not normally being able to muster any opposition, they were being welded into an army. And of course, one of the binding factors was the Quran. And the beliefs of Mohammedanism was the overall binding effect, and it was God instilling into them, obviously the power according to his will to fulfill his purpose. He was given them the ability to be able to have this devastating effect upon the Eastern Roman Empire. And he speaks of them in verse 3 of chapter 9 as the scorpions of the earth have power. Now again, the scorpions are quite well known and again spoken of quite often throughout the scriptures of truth. Have you got a scorpion? Charles has failed us. But again, if I can refer you to Thompson's Land and the Book, this time page 246, he again gives us some details of the scorpion, and even a picture if you'd like to have a look at it later on. But of course the great feature of the scorpion is the sting. And of course the sting of the scorpion is in its tail. And of course that is the idea in chapter 9, when in verse 3 the scorpions of the earth have power. And of course they do. Whereas the locusts, purely by great numbers, have a devastating effect. The scorpions are quite vicious individually. But there's one amazing feature which I didn't realise until I read upon these things, that the scorpion's sting, although very excruciating, very painful, is not always fatal. And quite often you can be stung by a scorpion, and although you'll be in terrible agony, it's not actually fatal. Now I often felt that the scorpion's sting was fatal, but it's not. It causes, as I say, immense pain, but it's not fatal. And again, if you want to read up on it, Thompson in his book Land and the Book gives us a lot of details about the scorpion. But that is interesting in verse 3, when we think of the uprise of the Saracens, the Arab power. They came out of the smoke, locusts, they were in great number. They were given power because they did begin to conquer, and they began to effect upon the Roman Empire, the eastern part of the Roman Empire, some terrible disasters as the scorpions of the earth have power. But the point was, it wasn't fatal to the eastern part of the Roman Empire. They did not literally kill them, put them to death. It wasn't to have a fatal blow upon the Eastern Roman Empire. And literally, as the scorpions of the earth have power, it was to inflict great pain and suffering, but it was not actually going to destroy. And then in verse 4, notice, it was commanded them that they should not hurt the grass of the earth, nor any green thing, nor any tree, but only those men which have not the seal of God in their foreheads. And again, we've seen the idea of the symbols of the grass and the trees before. All the peoples are as grass, and we've looked at Isaiah 40 and other places before. And it's speaking about peoples, and it's speaking about the things which were to happen by the Arabians upon the Roman Empire. But notice, it was commanded them that they should not hurt the grass of the earth, nor any green thing, nor any tree. They were told not to hurt them, but only those men which have not the seal of God in their foreheads. Now again, there is something specific as far as verse 4 is concerned. And this time I'm going to quote to you from Gibbon's Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire, and it's on page 455 of volume 3. And I want to read a speech which was made by the man Abu Bakr, the first caliph, as he sent his people on the rampage as they began to conquer the various parts of the Roman Empire. His instructions to the chiefs of the Syrian army were inspired by warlike fanaticism, which advances to seize and effects to despise the objects of worldly ambition. Remember, said the successor of the Prophet, Muhammad obviously, Abu Bakr being his successor, to his troops before they went on the rampage. Remember, he says, that you are always in the presence of God, on the verge of death, in the assurance of judgment, and the hope of paradise. Now, if I can just stop you there. Some people are, concerned, or at least query, how on earth the Lebanese and the Syrians and people like that can find these people who will do these kamikaze raids like upon the American embassy and all these sort of places. It's the same preaching and teaching as Abu Bakr gave to his troops. They are promised, if they will do this for their faith, a place in paradise. So it's a great honour for them to die for their faith, because they are assured of this great place in paradise. And of course that's what drives them on to do it. I don't know if it ever have the same effect upon the Christadelphians, but that's another matter. Anyway, in the assurance of judgment and the hope of paradise. And these are the points to notice against verse 4. Avoid injustice and oppression. Consult with your brethren and study to preserve the love and confidence of your troops. When you fight, notice, the battles of the Lord, acquit yourselves like men, without turning your backs, but not let your victory be stained with the blood of women or children. Destroy no palm trees, nor burn any fields of corn. Cut down no fruit trees, nor do any mischief to cattle, only such as you kill to eat. When you make any covenant or article, stand to it, and be as good as your word. As you will go, you will find some religious persons who live retired in monasteries, and propose to themselves to serve God that way. Let them alone, and neither kill them nor destroy their monasteries. And you will find another sort of people that belong, notice, to the synagogue of Satan, who have shaven crowns. Be sure you cleave their skulls, and give them no quarter till they either turn Mohammedans or pay tribute. All profane or frivolous conversation, all dangerous recollection of ancient quarrels was severely prohibited among the Arabs. In the tumult of the camp, the exercises of religion were assiduously practiced. And then Gibbon goes on. But those instructions were given to the troops before they marched out. Notice what it says in verse 4. It was commanded them that they should not hurt the people of the earth, nor, notice, any green thing, nor any tree, but only those men which have not the seal of God in their foreheads. The synagogue of Satan, who have got shaven crowns, cleave their skulls. The rest, leave alone. And that's what precisely the Arabians did. They were out to conquer lands, not destroy people, until, in their desire, they were to eventually get to Constantinople, and there they were going to effect their judgment. Unfortunately for them, they never got that far. But you'll notice the emphasis. Those who belonged to the synagogue of Satan, to the religion which of course was Trinitarianism, who were not had not the seal of God in their foreheads, but of course, as we were to later find out in the Apocalypse, was to have the mark of the beast in their foreheads, them destroy, because of course they opposed the one God belief of the Muslims. How much of that time? None at all. Right. Well, it would be unfair to start next time with verse 5. So we just conclude very briefly at this point that we have now seen the beginning of this power of the Arabians, the Saracens, as they first of all banded together under Muhammad with the establishment of the Quran and the Muslim faith, and now through Abu Bakr and the successors, they were beginning to have the effect upon the Eastern Roman Empire as they gained territory bit by bit with these specific commands of what they could and could not do. And this was eventually going to eat more and more into the Eastern Roman Empire until it began to have more effect upon them. So we'll leave it there for this night, and then next time, God willing, in a fortnight's time, we'll conclude, God willing, the consideration on this, and then we'll summarise the whole of the power of the Muslims and the effect they're having not only from that day but also at the present time. So we'll leave it there now.